Hello, thoughtful listener, and thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the lands in which we are situated. I'm joining from North Vancouver on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. Dr. Fisher, my guest, is joining us from Nanaimo on the traditional territories of the Seniamu First Nation. We acknowledge with gratitude the enduring presence, knowledge, and stewardship of Indigenous peoples on this land. As educators engaged in inquiry and relational learning, we recognize our responsibility to continue learning from Indigenous ways of understanding in community with responsibility and care. I'm Misty Paterson, and I'm a mother of two. My son is 12 and my daughter is 17. I'm a recent PhD graduate. I'm currently a teacher mentor with a public school district in Western Canada and an independent pedagogical consultant working with teachers in inquiry-based contexts locally and globally. Some of my previous roles include adjunct teaching professor, coordinator with the Community of Inquiry and Teacher Education cohort, and vice principal of the first public school in Western Canada to offer the International Baccalaureate Primary Years program. With a Master of Arts in Curriculum and Instruction from the Centre for Cross-Faculty Inquiry at the University of British Columbia, and specialized training in concept-based curriculum and instruction with Dr. Lois Lanning and Dr. Lynn Erickson, my work explores the many ways inquiry can be understood and practiced in educational settings. My doctoral research is a participatory, arts-based response to accumulating stress in schools, drawing on living inquiry, performative inquiry, embodied inquiry, and most recently, art care practices. I'm welcoming my guest, Dr. Fisher, and I'm so honored to join him in this conversation. Dr. Michael Fisher served as a mentor for me during my doctoral work and is one of the co-creators of Art Care. Dr. Fisher describes art care as the potent site of the intersectionality of teaching, learning, and caring, infused with arts as a process of restoring the communal as well as the individual. Dr. Fisher is an educator, artist, futurist, human resource consultant, executive coach, and scholar who has spent 40 years researching fear, trauma, healing, and violence in societies, organizations, and therapeutic and educational contexts. His work examines how fear shapes institutional responses, cultural narratives, and organizational change. And uniquely, his research asks critical questions of how such responses, narratives, and organizations in extreme environments shape the nature and meaning of fear. He received a 2000 to 2003 full fellowship from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for his doctoral work at the University of British Columbia on fearless leadership in times of crisis. He currently serves on faculty in the doctoral program in visionary practice and regenerative leadership at Southwestern College in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and is founder of his newest consulting and research venture called Fearlessness Labs. Dr. Fisher, thank you for joining me.
Oh, good to be here, Misty. I'm glad we could finally do this.
Me too. So, given the nature of the conversation, I would like to give listeners extra context and some boundaries. So, I'd like to first of all share how Dr. Fisher and I came to know one another. We first met through my doctoral work, where Dr. Fisher served as a mentor and thoughtful dialogue partner. Over time, our conversations grew into a shared inquiry around fear, education, and the role of creative practices in supporting well-being in schools, particularly through art care. Dr. Fisher, I've long appreciated the way you explore fear, violence, and learning, while also holding a deep commitment to care and transformation within educational communities. So today's conversation continues in that caring spirit of inquiry, one grounded in relationship, reflection, and a shared concern for the well-being of children, educators, and communities. Given the emotionally charged context we are speaking into, I also want to briefly share the boundaries of our conversation with our listeners. This dialogue is not about debating the details of tragedy, nor is it about examining its political, legal, or criminological dimensions. It is not about speculating about causes or evaluating the morality of those involved. Instead, this is a pedagogical, professional conversation. I enter this dialogue not only as a fellow researcher, but as a British Columbia teacher and teacher mentor, working alongside many colleagues who support young people every day as they make sense of a complex and sometimes painful world. And I'm also speaking to my British Columbia and International Baccalaureate contexts, my colleagues who work in IB settings, where much of my own facilitative work takes place, while also welcoming listeners who may be new to these approaches. For those who may be less familiar, educators in British Columbia and in IB programs work within a concept-based curriculum, where inquiry is understood as a process of sense-making, mattering, and meaning-making. Within this approach, concepts, or big ideas, serve as central organizers for learning. They help students explore complex realities, connect experiences, and deepen understanding over time. Similarly, the International Baccalaureate positions inquiry as its central pedagogy, emphasizing conceptual understanding as a primary goal of learning. In these inquiry contexts, teachers invite students to engage with real-world events and questions in ways that support them in becoming thoughtful and responsible members of their communities. This work is supported by dispositions such as those articulated in the IB Learner Profile, where educators encourage students to grow as inquirers, thinkers, communicators, being principled, open-minded, caring, risk-takers, balanced, and reflective learners. These attributes remind us that education is not only about acquiring knowledge, it is also about cultivating the habits of mind, heart, and action that enable young people to engage the world thoughtfully and ethically. And so we might pause with some questions. What might it mean to constitute tragedy itself as a concept for inquiry? And further, what happens to inquiry as a process when the subject matter becomes highly charged or painful? What educators often refer to as difficult conversations. When the realities we are inquiring into involve violence, grief, fear, or terror, the responsibility of inquiry becomes both ethically and emotionally complex. So today, Dr. Fisher, I'm seeking your guidance as an educator, as a fearologist, and a scholar about how we might facilitate careful inquiry into painful realities in ways that support the well-being of children, teachers, and communities. So listeners, our guiding question for this conversation is, how can educators facilitate meaningful inquiry about painful realities while supporting the well-being of students and communities? So, Dr. Fisher, your work has long examined what you call the culture of fear. When events like the recent shooting in British Columbia
Tumbler
occur,
Ridge, yeah.
that's right, in Tumbler Ridge, and other tragic events, what do you notice first about how communities begin meaning making of what has happened?
So I really like the intro, just to say that off the top. Thank you for that thoughtfulness to it. And the importance of conceptual language, worldview, the big picture, the big ideas that we articulate in an inquiry. So one of the things I do notice is I've studied pretty much since the Columbine disaster, high school tragedy of mass murder, 1999. A few other ones. Certainly 9/11 itself was another major event that I also studied those discourses. I was in the middle of my dissertation while that had happened. And then certainly COVID-19, the lockdown would be another very similar kind of mass, quote, terrorization at a certain level, the level of unknowns and the level of death and mortality, etc. And then certainly recently with Tumbler Ridge, February 10th, we've now had a month to process. So my research is a collective of all of that, and it's not statistical or that kind of research. It's a lot of observation, it's a lot of reading and a lot of thinking, talking to people. So off the top, one of the things that I've noticed is a hierarchy of information, and information is the foundation for knowledge, and from knowledge to knowing, and from knowing to know how is kind of my hierarchy of understanding of what we can do with information in its past. So one of the key things I noticed in all of these events, more or less, of course, the media is where I'm getting most of my information. So I'm not on the ground interviewing. So I'm doing cultural studies, right, by accessing media data on how a culture behaves in that sense. And of course, it can be a more local community, but then it's also very quickly, much more macro because of the global influence of these big events. Well, the hierarchy starts with basically the police. Is You could call it the criminological sphere of knowing and ways of knowing. And they are privileged in all of these incidents in this particular North American context. And one of the reasons is because there's been a crime. Makes sense, right? Crime, criminological. And so that starts to create the narrative. What went on? Please, some authority, tell us what went on. Obviously, people on the ground, they have all their narratives, they have their stories, and they have their experience. But I'm talking again as someone who is listening as a learner, right, to this event that just showed up on my phone, and that could be children are listening to this, teenagers, all kinds of people. So it has massive impact as what is sometimes called popular education. We're not just getting educated, children not getting educated just in the, as you say, the schooling sphere, where they're now getting educated primarily in the cultural sphere, popular education kind of, and very
Dr. Fisher,
informal.
just to clarify, when you're talking about the knowledge source, in simple terms, might we call that the news? What the police and others who are investigating the crime that took place, that's the source of the information that we might first get
Yep.
when something like this happens.
Yeah. And it's what that particular community around the event, or the closest of the tragedy, they just tend to grab that narrative first. They want to sell and market that particular narrative for all kinds of reasons, and they promote it. So that's the first thing. So you'll hear the interviews with the eventually detectives, or they'll bring in, for example, I'll see on CBC radio or television, oh, there's been this new discovery. So the recent one with the Nova Scotia and the Manitoba young teens that were possibly planning a mass shooting in schools in their two different areas. The immediate host would say something like, here's the news, here's what happened, and we're going to bring in a detective expert to talk about it, even though we have very little information. So that always I find amazingly interesting, and amazingly interesting that I wonder who's going to come next. And usually the next is a government official. And that is exactly what happened with the recent incident. It happened at Tumbler Ridge. It's happened in other things that I've studied. So the next will be like the mayor of the town, or, sometimes the premier of the province in Canada's context, or state governor, or something like that. And they make their particular narrative construction. So
So
those are
what
the
you're
first two.
So what you're sharing with us, and again, I'm thinking about, being a classroom teacher or others who are listening to this, and we're talking about the sources of information. So we've got primary sources and secondary sources in this sense. And we're talking about whose voice are we hearing first? When we are not on the ground, we're getting information about something that's happened. The first voices we're going to hear are likely the police from a criminological perspective. And then you're saying maybe a detective within that same sphere, and then maybe a state official, the mayor, leader of the province, etc., will come into the narrative next. So the content, if we can call it that, that we can engage in for our own sense making is informed from these perspectives and these individuals who, as you say, are privileged in access to this information and are shaping our understanding because that's the content that we have access to make sense of what's happened. Is
Yep.
that, am I following what you're saying? Is that right?
That's a
Yeah.
nice summary. Yeah, no, that's a good summary. And then generally quite often, and this is not the way news always was done, but now news people are always looking for a victim to interview. And so
There's a concept,
that will be
right?
really close. So
Victim,
what is
that's like a
victim?
central concept, right? Got it.
Victimization, right? We have this notion of victimization even, and there's actually a field of study called victimology.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's been around for a few decades. And, so it's not too far off that I'm calling my work fearology, because there's also traumatology, right? These new ways or disciplines of knowledge, they want to get in on the truth. They want to get in on the understanding, the sense making, the meaning making, and obviously hopefully influence decisions. So victims show up pretty quick with reporters. They're out there snooping. They'll go to the field. They'll fly their staff, those news reporters, in masses, and will spend a lot of money to try to get particularly a victim story here or there. And that's the case in all of these situations, especially with Tumbler Ridge recently.
So I'm making a connection here to hexagonal thinking. We sometimes
Okay.
use that in our at least I do often in our workshops, and I play this game, What Concepts Live Here? I'll just flash a little visual to those who are watching this on the video. But we also use the language, sorry, of conceptual lens. And so in this case, what I'm connecting to is the conceptual lens is victim or victimhood. Is that what we call it?
Could be.
So what I'm hearing you say is as a conceptual lens, we're running our sense making through that perspective or that window of interpretation. And again, we are relying upon those on the ground. In this case, you're talking about reporters flying in and trying to get stories, data, content that we can use to make sense of what's happened from afar. And this content is already being shaped by the conceptual lens of those gathering and giving us the content. In this case, the lens of looking for a victim.
Right. Thanks. And so I'm going to now maybe try and see if you can help me. I would say then there's a big idea
Mm-hmm.
that is kind of in the background, and there's
Mm-hmm.
probably a couple of them, and they're intermeshing. And I found this across all of these cases that I've studied and watched, and it makes a lot of logical sense. The biggest idea I would say is safety and security.
Right.
So why are we even caring about the story? There's crimes that go on all the time. We don't hear about them. A few get the press. They get the big, position on the news. And, and sadly, certainly in the culture of fear, if it bleeds, let it lead, is the newspaper reporter's motto. And that's actually in true. That is what news outlets use. And so that's part of, again, what's going on? Well, because blood is symbolic and real for a breach of security, right? The body, the embodied body of living, has been breached. And so that kind of crime is much more attractive, meaning much more terrifying. And you can just see how I
Hmm.
switch those from interesting to terrifying. And
Yes.
that is a good combination to get attention in this new attention economy that many people and futurists are talking about. We now live in an attention economy. That is like gold. That's like oil. in the old economies. Get people's attention,
Yeah.
and you're going to sell more advertising. You're going to get your channel known. You're going to get your reputation known.
I'm thinking totally. I mean, some educators who are listening might have Instagram accounts or social media accounts, and you're looking to have the algorithm pick up your content, which means people have to like it, save it, share it, and you need a good hook.
Well,
And so I'm hearing you, and I'm thinking, okay, so in is it fair to say that blood is the ultimate hook?
it's pretty big. I mean, sex would be next.
Right, right.
And that goes back to, many Freud and others who said
Mhm.
aggression, sexuality, they're deep motivators for human behavior. Um, love, pleasure end, and horror, repulsion, fear end of the
Mm.
spectrum.
So, as we look at sense making and what we as educators and our students have access to, it's really coming a large part from news organizations. And I heard you say we've got this conceptual lens of victim, and we're following the blood, we're following the terror.
Pretty much. And remember, we're following where the security was breached.
The security is breached. And would that be because we're trying to figure out ways to stay safe? Like I'm thinking about our, amygdala and how,
Mhm.
at least I understand from Dr. Rick Hansen and others, that our brains haven't developed all that much from early humans, and we're wired to survive. So we want to know where the threats are
Yeah.
and how to stay safe.
Yeah. So some people call that the reptilian brain,
Yes,
that really lower area of reflex to protect, is it safe? Where's the threat? If it happened there, is there going to be one here?
of course.
So
Natural
why am I
questions.
watching? I'm watching you because, oh, is that going to happen now at our place? That we're wired for that. That's what social behavior is. We're watching what's happening to who. Is that going to happen to me? And we're trying to figure out the best strategies to protect ourselves. So this is something when I shared some of the early discourse with you, Missy, and I think you remember saying something about, oh, there a lot of this sounds like people are buffering themselves.
Hmm.
The way they're interpreting the actual incident, the event, the encounter, which again, horrific, tragic, no one's saying it's not here. And yet, the discourses of control and power of privilege are going to be basically trying to say, it's safe. We've got this. And basically, then listen to us. And that means don't question us. I mean, you start looking at a kind of a control of knowledge and power distribution under distress.
Well, I'm
See, so
thinking
that's the context. We're distressed. We are
we're
in a
distressed. Well, I'm thinking again about the title of this conversation, the working title, which is around meaning making with painful content. So as I'm listening to you, and I'm thinking about educators who might be listening that are working with young children, and young can mean various things, but there is desire is not even the strong enough word, maybe a responsibility to support children in sense making. And isn't it important that we offer them a sense of safety? I'm thinking about, things I've read from CBC Kids News when horrific things happen. And one of the pieces of advice is to remind your child that this happened far away, if it did happen far away, and that they're safe. So, is a narrative that suggests or encourages us to feel safe wrong? What are the implications of a safety
yeah,
inspiring narrative? Because I was thinking, isn't that our responsibility as educators?
yeah. Well, what I guess I would want educationally is that, and psychologically and sociologically, is that safety does not trump everything like critical thinking. In other words, if you want to operate in that reptilian complex, right, in a communication system exchange, um, basically all the discourses that will come in those that hierarchy I'm talking about, um, they are coming with authoritative power. The media itself represents that. The news, the CBC, the national news, right? It's like, this is the national news, dot, dot. By that moment, you, at some level, it's like, pay attention. This is the authority. So this is very important in the psychodynamic of fear and what goes on with knowledge and power. And so basically, you are put in a position to receive almost as a victim yourself to the knowledge that's coming out.
So I'm thinking about, in British Columbia, and similar in the IB context as well, we have competencies or approaches to learning, and critical thinking is a huge element of this work. So what I understand is true, and I'm curious if this is true from what you know, but we need a sense of safety to be able to then think critically. So, in terms of, you're an educator, I'm thinking actually I have a few friends and colleagues who are teaching at the university level. They're teaching in teacher education. And they have, teacher candidates. These are teachers who are, sorry, these are students who are going to become teachers. And they're wondering, like, what would I do in the classroom if this kind of event happened and I'm the one that's responsible? So is there kind of an order of operations, or is there, like, what was the suggested methodology, if you can say, to receiving this information and sense making? Because I think we can expect the reptilian brain is going to come online for us as adults and for our learners.
Mm-hmm.
Do we want to support a sense of psychological safety and then move into critical thinking? What's your advice around?
I say I don't think it's quite as linear, clear, one before the other. So
Fair.
I don't know about that. That would be some time we'd have to really spend thinking, is that true? Is it really a hierarchy, right? Like a Maslow kind of hierarchy with safety and security on the
Yeah, that's what
bottom.
I'm thinking.
So that would be what most people would kind of argue. I'm reluctant to accept that fully and again, that would be a much more complex. And one of the reasons is just because we're not just wired on the reptilian brain.
Mm-hmm.
The reptilian brain is totally integrated with the mammalian brain, which is the feeling, affective, the mammalian brain, right? The nurturing. And that's wired with the forebrain. So why would we think it's completely hierarchical? I don't doubt there is some sorting of, well, us first, we're on this first. We're the specialists for danger, okay? But then you've got all the ways process your affective and the mammalian brain, right? And so on. So I think it's just too integrated of a system to parse out that it would be a pure hierarchy. And that's what when you look at a Maslow scale of hierarchy of needs, it looks nice and clean, but it's not very accurate. And there's many people who've criticized that model motivationally. But let me get back to the teachers. They are in a position to have to work with negotiating, if that's the word we would use, with their students who know. They're in the know. They saw it on their phone. They heard it from so-and-so or whatever. And you're that teacher, as you say, experienced or matured. And how are you going to now mediate that learning? And what I would say to start this kind of conversation down that learning path is, oh, we have something to learn from this. I wrote that on a card here the other day and I went, that just disrupts all of those, or at least to a major degree, the hierarchy of passing on from authorities to non-authorities, us receivers, information, knowledge, knowing, know-how. we're basically saying, we'll take charge of our learning. Thank you for the information. I don't want you not to give me the information, but we'll take charge because we can say, what have we got to learn here? Now, I will say in positive regard that at times, and I'll look at the Tumbler Ridge, the mayor, when he came on very quickly, he said, and I remember the church, a couple of the church people in the town, small town, rural, BC, they're pretty heavily, a lot of churches in small towns. I've lived in them, I know. And they came on in that first set of interviews as well. But what the mayor did say at one point, it kind of came out is, what have we got to learn from this? Something happened that's extreme, damaging, horrifying, but he did squeak it out. And I do think that's the empowered human. We will ask that question, what have we got to learn here? Because why are you watching what other people are doing and reacting to? Because you want to learn something from them. But
And I think
we
what I'm
do have to be critical in that learning too. And then we can add the other piece, Misty, what we'll come to in this talk, I'm sure, critical and creative, not one or the other only. That would be my general pedagogical dictum.
well, what I'm connecting to is well, a bunch of things, but what I wanted to mention right now is the link to in the IB program that notion of action, and
Okay.
that what do I have to learn from this? Is the creative brain is what's the creative work? I'm going to create some meaning here. So I'm not, what I'm hearing you say is we're not just accepting the meaning that's being made for us.
Yep.
We're treating that as a site of inquiry.
Nice,
It's
nice.
like, here's information, here's someone else's meaning,
Yep,
but I can now work with that information and make some meaning myself.
yep.
And doing that is an empowered place to be. And I'm thinking about that notion of victim earlier. Like, we don't need to be a victim of the information that's really scary and painful. We can work with that information in a way that can, transmediate that. And I think we're going to get into that a little bit too. One of the pieces that you had sent to me in terms of voices from Tumbler Ridge and how language plays such a big part of this sense making. We talked about the language of individual versus children. And I have a little visual here if you're watching this, but again, these are concepts that we might have in these hexagons, right? There's a relationship between children and individuals, but is there a strategic move that media is playing when they're using the word individuals to talk about who died versus the word children? I know in curriculum literature that matters. I'm thinking about Ted Aoki's work and encouraging us as educators to use the word children or
Okay.
youth or who we're working with, because it reminds us of the human as opposed to individual or students, can render our learners faceless, he kind of talks about. So I'm curious about the use of language in a strategic way that the media might be doing kind of on purpose. And is it to quell that fear that we might have or remove some of the affect? Because when we hear children died, it's different than hearing individuals died. I think I'm speculating, but yeah, curious
My
to hear your
experience would
thoughts.
be, I would agree there could be some differences there. My experiences would be is it's pretty blended. There are a lot of the reporting that they actually want you to get an affective resonance with the victims. And that's where often comes a compassionate response from audiences where they start sending letters to the victim's mother, for the child that passed. And you get quite a huge affective, marking and and dynamic. Now, some theorists have argued that within the culture of fear, for a culture of fear to operate, and this is where basically we're trying to manage fear in a culture of fear, but we're actually creating more fear and trying to manage it, not less. That's my simple definition after doing an intense study of the literature on culture of fear for cross disciplines. That's the system problem. It doesn't shut off, it doesn't actually help fully, it actually creates more fear. Now, if it wasn't doing that, then I would call it probably a culture of fearlessness. It's learned enough how to catch itself and correct that constant contagion of creating more and more and more fear that you're going to be the victim next. Well, that incident here in Tumbler Ridge, that lines up with an incident that happened in Saskatchewan, or and then media do that. They chain what's called chain linking tragedies. And then they can report on that for the next few days if this one gets boring. The viewer are hooked onto these chains, and we'll bring in another expert and another expert from that. And before you know it, you wonder, what am I playing in here? Like, what has this got to do with the real experience of someone in my province, just, a few hours away, or my town? And so what happens is this linking becomes what's called general conditioning, right? Fear, you learn that in Psych 101. Fear will generalize its conditioning. So you will see something that reminds you of that incident, and you're as afraid of that which reminds you as you were of the actual thing that actually you were afraid of, right? So general conditioning, and that's part of learning where our brains will learn that way
Well, I'm thinking again,
if
in
we're not on top of it,
if we're not on
catching
top
it.
of it. I'm remembering, the training that I did with Dr. Lynn Erickson and Dr. Lois Lanning in concept-based curriculum and instruction. And again, whether you're in British Columbia or you're working in the IB program, we're mandated to help children understand concepts and connect them in big idea statements or generalizations. We're mandated to help children pattern. So this
Could you
pattern.
elaborate pattern for a moment?
Yeah, so pattern is like I see this, I can explain this phenomenon. I'm making sense of this phenomenon in a particular way.
Okay.
And I can then find other examples
Right.
of the same big idea statement, same relationship, conceptual relationship elsewhere. And if we look at David Perkins' work in learning transfer and others, we're looking kind of at near transfer and far transfer. So near transfer would be it's a similar phenomenon or context as the one that was taught, the instructional one. Far being it's quite different, but we
Yeah.
can make that connection. So I'm thinking, is the media not being excellent patterners in the sense that they're just delivering us this incident is the same as this one, as this one, as this one, as this one. So aren't they helping us to build these chains, these big idea statements, conceptually? Like one would argue, isn't that good?
Yeah, you could argue it's good news, right? It's like you're being informed. And what I would say just off the top is the news media will rarely ever bring in an actual educator to the interviews after a tragedy. It's so
Well,
low on the hierarchy of why would you want to bring in an educator? Well, might bring in a psychiatrist, mental health problem, right, with the criminal. But where's the educator that is actually helping us learn in the sight of the conflict, the tragedy, the horror, the fear, the terror? They are, in a way, these mass murders, they're acts of terrorism, one way or another, but they're insider acts for the most part, right? They're inside the system. So that's called domestic terrorism. It's not the political, typical terrorist. So I have adopted that language to help me understand just to, when you give it to people, this is not just a crime. What's actually going on in the pattern of the system, so here's pattern, is the replication of a culture of fear slash terror in its extreme. But you know what? The culture of fear is what bred and is breeding the final big blow, the big bomb, the big attack. Then it's terror. But what's be underneath all that? And so I invented a word called fearism. Fearism is underneath, it's the soft belly. It's the more invisible every day. We just absorb this stuff, we just eat it, yeah, from media and so on. And we're eating a lot of that basically fear-based knowledge and information that's being fed to us for the purpose of them gathering your attention because fear is a great glue. It's a good hook.
So I think what I'm hearing you say is we are receiving sense making, and we're receiving that in the initial narratives when a horrific incident takes place. We're also receiving it in the form of patterns. And this is happening here, and
Definitely
it links to
patterns.
that, and it links to this,
Yeah.
which creates this feedback loop.
Yeah.
And it's a feedback loop of, yes, sense making, but the narrative is be afraid.
That's right.
And you're advocating for us to be aware of that, of be aware of what you're consuming, and when you're sense making, interrupt this pattern of it's more and more and more fear.
Yeah. Understanding the context. So if we don't teach children, young people, all of us, oh, there's a lot of people, I'm talking thousands of researchers that are using the concept culture of fear, and they have since the late 1990s. That's historical fact. Now, you got to go, why are they doing that? And these are critical, like they're critical of that. But people are weaponizing it like crazy. They weaponize the culture of fear to build more attention and grab more people to pay attention to their blog, to their media, to them as a leader, as a guru, as a follower, as a leader. So we're weaponizing, and so culture of fear just basically say fear is being weaponized. I mean, that would be the most simple thing. And then you go, what does that mean, children? Fear is being weaponized. What an interesting question. And
What
then
does it mean, Dr. Fisher?
and then you can break it down based on developmental levels of inquiry. What would it mean when fear becomes a weapon?
What does it mean?
And I think a child would say, oh, is that when somebody who doesn't like me and is bullying me scares me and says, there's a ghost behind you? Or, yeah. What are they doing? That's weaponizing fear against
Using
another.
fear to hurt
Exactly.
somebody on purpose.
And yeah, absolutely on purpose. Now, you could say sometimes
Wow.
it's not so on purpose. Yeah, I would agree. Sometimes it's just ignorance. Sometimes it's habit. The person doesn't really thought about what they're doing. But I can tell you right now, you think of any school teacher, most who are at least teaching in primary, but at least junior high and senior high, they're going to say, if you show a lot of fear as a teacher, you're in trouble because they will use it against you. They will go after your fear once they see it, and you're going to have a tough time coming back. Not that you can't, you can, but it's a hard recovery. I just heard a teacher saying that the other day. You don't want to show your fear in class the first early part of the year because it's going to be hard to get it back. So why? Because the culture of fear is working. It's weaponizing fear to get power over another.
I was just going to use the word control.
Yeah.
When we have people who are fearful, and we are showing up as the authority, if our children are scared of us, that used to sort of be the teaching, right? Of like,
Right.
you come in, you start the class at the beginning of the year, and you're really firm and strict
Oh,
and
yeah.
like maybe even mean. The kids should be scared of you.
Yeah.
I think that narrative it has changed in my circles for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, there is this definite relationship between fear and control. So, which links back to the sense making piece of, well, if we are absorbing other people's sense making and they're giving us a pattern of be afraid, be afraid, be afraid, it's sounding like it's fair to say that that is a bit of a form of control or power over
Yeah.
us and our own sense making. Dr. Fisher, I'm wondering if this is a good time to look at a counter narrative from one of the 12-year-olds that was on site,
Yep.
Maddie, and to
Yep.
share what her thoughts are and
Sure.
her sense making. Yeah.
Let's get,
So
let's just give the stage here to, I think 14. Is she 14?
she's 12.
Well,
She's 12.
a
She's
member,
12.
a student in the high school when it was attacked. And she even says that she was in the washroom. I'm just going to give a little background to the quote. And it's a wonderful interview done on CBC or CTV. And they actually had her alone on camera. I do not know how they got that. And it was very like 7 days after or 6 days after, like really early. And she's standing in front of the memorial, right outside of the school where I think it was more downtown. But, and so 12 years old, she's on her own. I do not see any parents around. She's calm and collected, but really fierce and really concentrated, and she's grieving in her way. And the interviewer asks her a question. And just to say, she was hiding in the washroom for 2 hours because she was in the washroom when the event and the siren went off in the school, alone for 2 hours in a washroom, at least locking her door partially. And she said, when I left, I had to walk around the shooter who was laying in the stairway as the police guided me around their body. So just to give you a context, and this young person, what she said, I was so astounded by. This is a different discourse. Go ahead.
And Maddie, I believe, was responding to a question about the school, right? And should the school stay or children be welcomed back into the school? And she says, I want the school to stay because even though the parents are scared and the kids are, us kids need to know that we are going to be safe and we need to face our fears. So if you're watching this interview, I'm just holding up her quote here so you can visualize it. Um, so Dr. Fisher, give us the analyzing here of what is happening with Maddie's discourse as a counter to the one that is perpetuating be
Well,
afraid. This is happening all over the place.
yeah, just hold it there. That's really good. It's useful for me to look at it too, because it's also, you have to kind of read between lines too. This is a real human being. And
Who's
so,
12?
yeah,
That's grade 7 likely. My
yeah,
son is
I would
12.
say grade seven, that in that school, they were
Yep.
seven to high school, right? To 12. Yeah. So what I pick up is such intelligence here, which I start with that. We have a defense intelligence that is incredibly well built in and defends us. We talked about the reptilian complex earlier. It's not just stupid and dumb, okay? Like it doesn't just go duh, duh. No, it actually is very synced, and it's very synced with a lot of intelligences in all parts, the environment itself. This intelligence that's coming out here is admitting the first thing, there's no bravado for a moment in that discourse. I have to say, I analyze a lot of texts of people who say, I'm fearless, no fear here, and on and on. Kids will chant, they'll use that too. Teenagers, adults use that. And that is what's called counterphobic reaction formation, is you actually are afraid, but you're basically saying you're not. It's a very quick strategy. It's one that they've learned from people, a way to hide, buffer from actually feeling things. Here, no bravado, not an instant. What it is completely compassionate, because it says, I know you're afraid, mom and dad and parent. I know the kids myself included, am afraid. That owning and identifying with, that's compassion of the highest level. And she's not panicking. You guys, we got to go back to our school. There's no panic. And then she comes, and here's the empowerment piece. Here is the action of the learner. And we need to face our fears. And what I would add, if I was sitting with her, is, and do you mean face your fears so that you can learn something important from this? Question mark. Thanks. That's what I would say.
How did Maddie arrive in this place where she is able to be compassionate 7 days after a hugely traumatic event?
Yeah, beyond
I know
it.
it's hard to say, we're not speaking with her, but in your expert opinion,
Well, I will say I
how
do
was she able to do this?
obviously don't know enough anything about them. And if I was to go to Tumbler Ridge, which I'd love to at some point to help out, um, I would really look that person up and I would do an interview. Now, on the theoretical level, which is not just theoretical, it comes with a lot of years and decades of thinking, research, and empirical studies. The principle of fear that I work with in the context of a fearlessness context, not a culture of fear context. Culture of fear is real. What's going on at some level, arguably. Some people may not think so, but it's pretty obvious to me, and there's enough people saying it that I would probably buy it. But the fearlessness context is, and it operates on a different dictum. It says, when fear appears, so then does fearlessness. That is built into us from day zero plus, and our evolutionary past or creational past, whatever you want to say. We got the download to handle fear.
We got the download to handle fear. What a great quote. I feel like I did not receive this message. I got the
You
message
didn't. You didn't.
of we're wired to survive and fight, flight, or freeze. I didn't get the message that we're downloaded for fearlessness. So what does that look like?
Thank you. Let's just take from Maddie is it looks like exactly what you saw. That discourse, that intelligence in the defense system coming through above all the crowd, above everyone I've listened to, every authority, every expert. And it just like comes through and I can recognize it because I've studied fearlessness for so long. I just go, whoa, there it is, like so pure form. And it comes through and it basically says, because fear is the carrier of access to compassion.
Fear is the carrier for access
Access to
to
compassion.
compassion. So this is making me connect to work that I've learned from you through art care
Okay.
and the notion that art working, as Braca Ettinger calls it, but working creatively can help to mediate or transmediate fear into compassion.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you want to speak a little bit to that in terms of, if you could wave a magic wand and be the educator that is going up and, taking responsibility for offering a site of inquiry in these painful times.
Yeah.
Would you call upon the arts to support that work?
Yeah.
How would you help to transmediate this fear into compassion?
So yeah, with some kind of diagram, chart, song, poem, whatever we use for medium to translate to the different ages and different groups of people, and they can help create those. There would basically be stay critical, stay creative, stay compassionate. holding my hands over my heart. Stay critical, stay creative, stay compassionate. So we just built a little triangle. Could have been a hexagon. Whatever models you want to play with, this structuring of these big principles, these big ideas, that's what holds the container that we can handle terror. We can handle the post-traumatic so much better because we have some mapping conceptually for the unknown, for the terrifying, for what is so disruptive to our normal ways of knowing. After an incident of this kind, people need a new map. And
Mhm.
unfortunately, we're letting those hierarchies of news media and experts on media, for the most part, not alone, they're constructing the map of how we make sense. But what's worse, I have to say that I see this in every incident of all these extremes. The first people that get on, if it isn't the police on the scene, it's the government leader, or sometimes, sadly, it's the parent of a victim or another victim who was witnessed. And the language is this, and it's so important to what you started with today about sense making. The language, sadly, is this is such a senseless attack. Dot, dot, dot. I've heard that consistently. Not everybody says it every moment when they're interviewed, but it is there. It repeats. It's like a tape recording message. And I think that is the buffer to not take it personally, to not feel you've been attacked personally in some way, but that's even hard. Like a school attack, they were not shooting after, targets, they were just hunting. That's the narrative that's running for the teenager. What are we doing there? We're trying to buffer away that it actually was a meaningful thing that happened to the person who did it. They are not inhuman. They may not be morally human, but they are still a human. And we see that discourse of this makes no sense, a senseless crime. The moment you do that, there is nothing to learn, Misty, is there?
Mm.
It finishes the learning off. It's a deadly pedagogical error. And unfortunately, people just have not been trained how to talk in sites of great tragedy. Our best leaders, our top leaders, including the police, and we don't have trauma-informed people for the most part. They may have taken their short little course, but when you watch them operationalize it, they haven't got it. Because they're saying stuff like that. It's the very opposite of what the pedagogue would say. That's why they're not interviewing teachers. The teacher says, we want to make sense. There's something to learn from sites of conflict and horror. We want our children to be adaptive in their intelligence, not just be able to do all those wonderful learning things in a safe, calm environment. Because you know what? Life is over here and it ain't pretty often. And it's getting, in many cases, worse. So this is what we're talking about today is adaptive intelligence, right? And defense
Mhm.
intelligence. We have intelligence to draw on, but we're really far behind the eight ball, so to speak. We're catching up behind. The incidences are coming faster, the tragic, then we're able to metabolize and then build these architectures for learning insights of fear from a perspective of fearlessness. That would be my ideal for curriculum.
So I'm going to bring ideas together. I'm
Yeah,
going to attempt to bring ideas together because we
love it.
covered a lot of terrain today. But one of the anchor concepts that we've talked about is sense or sense making. And we've talked about we are sense makers as humans. We want to understand why something has happened. We want it to make sense. and that we are meaning making with information that's being provided to us that comes already through conceptual lenses, oftentimes the lens of victim you talked about. That we're downloading someone else's sense making through patterns of fear. And that instead of accepting this was a senseless act or crime, tragedy, that we reclaim our capacity, our downloaded DNA to make sense of something, to know that we can transmediate the fear into compassion, into something that's more life affirming, higher vibration, more empowered, more conscious. And that's the pedagog's job, is what I'm hearing you say,
Yep.
is asking questions around pedagogical maps that help us to think about compassion, that helps us to name our emotions and states of being. I'm thinking about Dan Siegel's work and Name It to Tame It. Yes, I am afraid. Yes,
Yeah.
this is scary. What can we learn from this? How can we be compassionate here? Where can compassion be found here? So as we start to wrap up, I'm wondering if
Yep.
you could give us again the three elements in this map that you're offering to us for sense making. And I'm wondering if you might leave us with a couple of questions that we can ask. You left us with one for sure of what can we learn here, but I'm curious if there might be any other questions that we could ask our dialogue with our students about. Clearly, depending on age and stage of development, et cetera.
Yeah.
Using our wise judgment as pedagogues in the context in which we find ourselves, if you could give us some inspiration, again, reviewing your map and some questions we could ask.
So learning/teaching, insights of tragedy, horror, memory of, post-traumatic of, whatever the events are of this encounter with something so horrific. A way to ground is we can teach and learn in that site rather than trying to wait for someone else to secure the safety. You can wait, and I'm not saying you don't want to receive some safety, but some safety comes at a great cost to you. In other words, somebody's going to be an authority over you, controlling you. So what you do, you counter that with critical, creative, compassionate. And you basically say, no one, not even the terrorist, is going to own that triangle. I own it.
So we talk a lot in the IB program about ownership,
Do you?
choice,
Okay.
voice, and ownership. When we talk about learner agency, is the model, the conceptual map that's offered.
Okay.
So what I'm hearing is invite your students to step into their agency,
Exactly.
treating painful content as a site of inquiry. It is a site of meaning making where we can be critical of the information that we're receiving. We can be creative with it in terms of our own meaning making, the stories that we are telling ourselves, always with a lens of compassion.
Yeah. And then maybe another question is, I really highly recommend everyone take some time when you have time and when you see it's important. If you don't see it's important, it's not going to be important. But if you do, who is your guide? Where do you draw your information, expertise, guidance, teachings on fearlessness? Where
Educate
did where,
yourself and
where were
have
those
your
where were
own
those
principles and practices. Yeah, your own beliefs around
yeah
fearlessness. Yeah,
and
and
ch-
your
and
work is a great
yeah
place to
check your
start.
inventory, right? Like check your inventory. Where did it come from? And then you can reclaim that add to your own. And yes, if you want to look at my work, I've probably written on fearlessness more than anybody in the world that I know of. So, but it's many sources. I synthesize other people's work.
As good researchers do,
Yes.
because you're a patterner.
So I
Um,
think that's time.
it is time, and it's gone by quickly. And I can imagine, I can imagine certain listeners in my ear as
Okay.
we're having this
I'll bet you can.
conversation, and but Misty, you didn't ask this question or this question, and but I guess just to review, I think one of the first questions is, how do we get started? So, reading your work is one way to get started. Reading around compassion, critical thinking, narrative, and the power of narrative. We didn't get into that in detail, but that's a huge piece of things. Emotions and recognizing emotions and being able to state how we're feeling about something.
For sure.
Take someone else's perspective. There's lots of good picture books around this area
Yep.
too. And just we wanted to leave all listeners with a lot of gratitude for joining us in this conversation around painful content. This is something that many of us can want to shy away from because it can be hard. It can tug on our heartstrings. So we just want to say thank you for the work that you do with your learners every day, and to know that you are not alone in carrying the questions of teaching curriculum while accompanying young people through difficult realities with care and responsibility. Dr. Fisher and I are walking alongside you in that work. If you have questions or would value a space to reflect together, please feel free to reach out to us. We will be sharing our contact information in the notes or wherever you are finding the link to this recording. We would be honored to hold space for your ongoing meaning making. Dr. Fisher, thank you so much for the decades of work that you have done and dedicated to helping educators understand fear, learning, and transformation, all with a compassionate lens. We've really, really learned so much from you. I know I'm speaking on behalf of the listeners here, but I know that's going to be true. And I'm sure you're going to hear from a group of us wanting to know more. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. All the best.